Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're coming now to the very last lecture on our study of church history. We're going to be speaking about the modern and the postmodern church. In our timeline, we looked in the last few classes at the 1800s leading up into the 1900s. We saw the First and Second Great Awakening, taking place in the early 1800s. And at the same time, we saw movements such as Darby and the dispensational groups, the Millerites, which led up to the Seventh-day Adventists, the rise of the Mormon. I'm going to call it a separate religion. I don't think it's part of Christianity. Likewise, Darwin, which you can almost call evolution a sort of a religious system as well, an anti-religious system, and groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, cults which claim Christianity and yet are a major departure from Christian orthodoxy. We have the response to liberalism with the fundamental movement and people like Machen, who were stalwarts for orthodoxy, World War I, World War II, and I want to speak a minute about Vatican II, because as that comes on the scene, that's going to have a huge impact on the Roman Catholic Church. In the 1960s, a new church council is called, and some of the distinctions that come out of that, one of the big ones is that Roman Catholics officially now are allowed to read the scriptures. You say, well, weren't they always? I'm not so sure whether it was official or not, but prior to this, priests would commonly tell their parishioners, do not read the scriptures, because if you do, then you're going to come up with some other conclusion other than what the church teaches. And they might have been right about that, but I think it's good for us to read the scriptures, and good for the scriptures to be the foundation of our faith. Billy Graham has a big impact on the 20th century, a evangelist who goes around the world and becomes a household name. The Jesus movement comes about in the 1960s, and this is a time when there is much skepticism toward organized religion. Of course, I always ask people, if you don't like organized religion, what is the alternative? Is it disorganized religion? But there's a group from the hippie culture that all of a sudden really and truly fall in love with Jesus. And they're coming into the church and wanting to be part of that. And there are churches that are springing up that are oriented toward that movement. Now, we also have the ecumenical movement. That's a movement toward religious unity. Christian ecumenicism, though, needs to be distinguished from religious pluralism. Religious pluralism says everything is right. It doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you believe something. Versus Christian ecumenical, the Christian ecumenical movement says, yes, we do have our distinctives, but we are going to look for places where we can agree, where we can work together in spite of our differences. And it's in that context that Vatican II takes place. As we said, there's some big things that happen in Vatican II, a softening of the Roman Catholic Church as far as their stance toward all the other churches. Before, they were just saying all the other churches are going to hell, and they say, well, we didn't quite mean it quite that strongly. Maybe we overstated it. And so you have that, and also an appeal to the scriptures, where they're going to begin reading the scriptures, and as a result, whenever people read the scriptures, they begin coming to know the Lord, and that's a wonderful thing. The anathemas are rescinded. Prior to this, not only had, remember, the Roman Catholic Church had excommunicated the Greek Orthodox Church, and they had returned the favor, and not only excommunicated them, they had pronounced anathemas, curses upon them, and these are rescinded in 1965. Pope John Paul II actually visits the Patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church in 1999, a big change, to the first time that sort of thing had taken place in 1,000 years. We have the World Council of Churches forming in 1948. This is made up of Protestant, Independent, and Orthodox churches, but not the Roman Catholic Church. It does not become part of the World Council. They're coming together to work where they can together on political issues, but sometimes politics makes strange bedfellows, it said, and sometimes there are different views within these churches as to some of those political issues. For example, on the one hand, the seeking to have Israeli and Arab and Palestinian rights, I think, is a good and proper goal. Of course, not all of those folk are going to play nicely together. It's hard to try to give somebody rights when they are sending out suicide bombers and things like that. There was also the issue that some of those churches wanted to support communist rebels who had their own particular agenda. And so this World Council had a tendency to be associated with a bit of a communist agenda, and that's unfortunate. But on the good side, there was the facilitation of dialogue between different denominations. And I think it's good and can be helpful when different denominations can talk to each other, because maybe we can each bring something positive to the table. Francis Schaeffer, he has a big impact in the latter part of the 20th century. Now, he's going to die in 1984, but prior to this, he establishes a Christian Studies Center in L'Abri, Switzerland, and he is a thinker and a Christian philosopher who seeks to speak out to the philosophical issues that he sees on the horizon. And so he's going to speak on the issue of relativist thinking, that sort of thinking that has given rise nowadays to postmodernism. The term postmodernism hasn't even been invented yet, and he's already speaking to that issue. And so he's bringing people to see Christianity as true truth. And he's also taking the future postmodernists, and then bringing them to see what are going to be the results of his conclusion, to see the hopelessness of their views without Christ. The 1960s are a time of great change. You notice some of the photos here. You've got the Beatles, which are the music group that just sort of revolutionized music, and that's still being felt today. There is a very unpopular war, the Vietnam War, in which the United States is involved, and that brings a whole generation that is suspect against the government and against organization. You have Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, and it's a wonderful movement, and I'm glad to say that there are folks that were in my own Presbyterian denomination, although they weren't black, they were marching with them and giving support to them, and I think that's a great thing. Of course, at the end of the 1960s, we put a man on the moon. And that was, again, a huge, if I can borrow the words there, leap for mankind. Teresa of Calcutta has become, Mother Teresa as she's known, has become sort of a byword among people today. Most everybody, whether they're in church or not, has heard of her nowadays. She was born in Macedonia, and she was a Roman Catholic nun who served in the country of India among the poorest of the poor. She felt a call to serve to the poor outside the convent, and so instead of being there just in the convent, she would go out and serve the people on the street. Malcolm Muggeridge, a writer, wrote a book, first started out as an article and then a book called Something Beautiful for God, and he's the one who sort of put her on the spotlight. If it hadn't been for Muggeridge, we might never have heard of her. I'm sure the people on the street whom she served had heard of her. She says that love begins at home with family and friends, and when people ask, what should we do? She said, begin by loving the outcast in your life, the one that you know, maybe that member of the family who's sort of the black sheep. Love that person. And she says, love is not defined by extraordinary deeds, but in the daily giving of yourself to another. Wise words. Gustavo Gutierrez comes out with his theology of liberation in the 1970s. He's a professor at Notre Dame University, a Roman Catholic, and he's speaking of salvation in terms of liberation from social and economic injustice. and he gains a hearing, and some things probably do need to be said, but he's orienting this toward a political outreach toward communism. And there comes a point where the Roman Catholic Church says enough is enough. You need to quiet that down or change your tune. And so he's called on the carpet by his own church because of his Marxist approach to Christianity. In the 1970s and going into the 1980s, we have Chuck Smith, the founder of the Calvary Chapel movement. He founds not just his own church, but it gives rise to sort of a non-denominational denomination. They don't like to use the term denomination, but they have their own Bible college and their own publications, and it sure looks like a denomination to me. And I think a positive one. Now it's dispensational and probably sort of semi-Arminian Pentecostal, but it reaches out to the Jesus movement in a wonderful way and brings them to know the Lord, and it's really effective in reaching unchurched people and people that have been disenfranchised by various church denominations. He has a rolling commentary style of preaching, and likewise those who follow him adopt that same style in many cases. In the 1990s, early in the, I guess it was actually 89, I got this package in the mail from my older brother who lives in Germany, and it was this ugly piece of sort of crumbling masonry, and I looked at that and thought, what on earth is this? He happened to be in Berlin when the Berlin Wall was pulled down, and had one of the workers here cut me off a piece of that and put it in a package and mailed it to me. But that marked the end of the USSR and the end of Russian communism, and that really changed the world, where suddenly Christianity could now go in. It had officially been barred from all those Eastern European countries and from Russia itself, but now Christianity was allowed to go in, and it went in and flourished in many cases. Of course, there was a seed there that people had been told for 70 years there is no God, and all of a sudden you're allowed to be told about God, and they had a real hunger for the scriptures. A comedian noted just in the 20th century, some of the magazine articles, or magazine titles actually, there was Life magazine, and it was known for its great photographs and picturing all areas of life. And then maybe 20 years later, they came out with People magazine, which is sort of a subset of life, I suppose. People are alive, but there's life, and then there's people. And then another generation passes, and we have a magazine called Us, which is sort of different than them. There's us and them and people, but not all people are us. And now I understand there's a magazine called Self, and I have no idea what's in these. I'm just looking at the titles. And my point is that we have become very me-oriented. Notice you go from life to people to us to self. And likewise, this has shown up in what's called self-esteem parenting, which over the course of a generation led to narcissistic children. People they're just concerned about me. What's in it for me? In a speech in 2008, Pope Benedict said, side by side with material prosperity, a spiritual desert is spreading, an interior emptiness, an unnamed fear, a quiet sense of despair. And he's speaking about this lack of foundation in community where we're all about us, and that leaves you so very empty. Now, one of the responses to that has been the megachurch. The megachurch has been defined as that church which has over 2,000 attending. It's usually found in the suburban areas, not in the inner city, not way out in the country, but you've got to be sort of close to a lot of people. Functionally, they are non-denominational. Now, they might belong to a denomination, but you don't really hear about it. You don't really see it. It's not on their sign, and so they function as if they're non-denominational. And you go to a megachurch and there's something for everyone. The numbers of those involved I find very interesting. It has been estimated, at least nowadays, that the successful megachurch has about 55% of the members actively involved. That's huge, because normally you go into any smaller church and the average is what they call the 20-80 principle, 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. But the megachurch has a tendency to get many more people involved. It's usually built around one highly gifted spiritual leader, and of course, there goes the rub. As go the leader, so goes the church. Now, a new thing for the 21st century has been what's been called the emergent church, and this is oriented toward postmodernism. There is in the emergent church a de-emphasis on doctrine, on teaching. The idea, we don't really care what you believe, just believe something, or don't believe anything, I suppose. An openness to new ideas. Somebody said, when you keep an open mind, don't forget to keep the screen door in place so as to not let in the flies. It's seeking community, and I suppose that's a good thing, because the church ought to be all about community. Again, that's a answer to the felt need of the isolationism of the me generation. And so there is participatory worship, and again, that is a good thing. That's a biblical thing. But there's been an issue, a tension between do you shape theology to suit culture, or do you adapt methods to reach culture? And I propose that shaping theology to suit culture is a dangerous road on which to travel. Now, by contrast, I think I can show biblical examples where even people like the Apostle Paul adapted their methods to reach culture. Jesus himself became incarnational. He took on flesh in order to reach those with skin on. And I think we're called to do that same thing. Spencer Book, speaking in support of the emergent church, he says, "When I say I'm a universalist, what I really mean is that I don't believe you have to convert to any particular religion to find God. As I see it, God finds us, and it has nothing to do with subscribing to any particular religious view." That's simply not true. The scriptures actually espouse and teach a particular religious view, and to toss that out is to toss out Christianity. Dan Kimball, again in support of the emergent church, says the old paradigm taught that if you had the right teaching, you will experience God. The new paradigm says that if you experience God, you will have the right teaching. But I suggest they are not mutually exclusive. That the right teaching goes hand in hand with really knowing and experiencing God. Otherwise, you're experiencing something other than God. And so there is a call here to return to the truth of the scriptures. The emergent church, I think, is perhaps going to be seen as sort of a flash in the pan. And even there's a desire to go back to the Christian roots. And those roots are found in the Christian teachings.